Welcome, everyone. It's really lovely to see such a big crowd in this lovely, sunny room. I'm really delighted to be here today and introduce our concluding public event in celebration of democracy, past, present, and future. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Wojciech Sadurski, the Chalice Professor of Jurisprudence at the University of Sydney Law School, as our special guest speaker. It probably goes without saying that when we launched this year in the Fox Center with Steve Levitsky and Carol Anderson speaking on the threats to democracy, and with our journalist colleagues from The Guardian on the fight to vote, there was already a heaviness in the air. Cautionary discussions of democratic backsliding, voter suppression, and references to the dystopian vision mapped out in Project 2025. Even still, and perhaps here I'm exposing my own naive optimism, there were some spaces of hope and, dare I say, joy in the lead up to the 2024 election. But we're in a very different and much darker place today. The remarkable speed with which institutions many of us held to be critical anchors of American democracy are being dismantled almost overnight. And I had to revise these remarks 3 times just to reflect some of those recent changes. Just yesterday, we were informed of the very dismantling and defunding of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Only hours ago, we learned of our colleague, Kevin Young, director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, joining the ranks of the removed from leadership of the Smithsonian Network of Museums. He was the director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. These, just the latest in a broad-based assault on our revered universities, rooted in a tradition of free speech, our leadership in global scientific discovery and public health, have particular resonance for all of us at Emory and our close friends and neighbors at the CDC. Clearly, we're at a crossroads where critical scholarship, bold voices, and the levers of a functioning, uncorrupted judicial system are essential if we are to protect democratic institutions and the rule of law. I can think of no better person and interlocutor for this moment than our guest today. Professor Sadurski is a scholar of jurisprudence, political philosophy, constitutional theory, and comparative constitutionalism, with particular expertise on Central and Eastern Europe. Born in Warsaw, he migrated to Australia in 1981, holding dual citizenship and dual professorships at the University of Sydney and the Center for Europe at the University of Warsaw. He is the author and editor of many, many books, 8 single-authored monographs, 14 edited volumes, and I stopped counting before the special journal issues. I'll just mention 3 of his most recent monographs, published by either Oxford or Cambridge University presses: Constitutional Public Reason, published in 2023, A Pandemic of Populists in 2020, and Poland's Constitutional Breakdown in 2019. Beyond his dual academic appointments, Professor Sadurski has been a visiting professor in schools of law in Italy and Singapore, as well as many American institutions, Yale and NYU, Fordham and Cardozo, and currently he resides at Princeton. An outspoken critic of the autocratic and authoritarian practices of Poland's populist Law and Justice Party, he has been sued for defamation by state television and the ruling party on not 1, but I learned just a few minutes ago, 4 separate occasions. They've all been settled, happily. In one instance, for metaphorically describing the ruling party as an organized crime group. Campaigns in defense of his free speech were mounted by hundreds of law professors and the European Parliament, the Dutch Parliament, and the Human Rights Institute of the International Bar Association. All have defended Professor Sadurski's right to criticize the government without fear of retribution or imprisonment. I now want to borrow a poem by Czesław Miłosz, and thank you to Hubert for correcting my pronunciation. This is a poem that I'm quoting from Professor Sadurski's excerpt in his book on Poland's constitutional breakdown. And I especially loved this poem as the poet addresses himself to the rulers. You who wronged. You who wronged a simple man, bursting into laughter at the crime, and kept a pack of fools around you to mix good and evil, to blur the line. Though everyone bowed down before you, saying virtue and wisdom lit your way, striking gold medals in your honor, glad to have survived another day. Do not feel safe, the poet remembers. You can kill one, but another is born. The words are written down, the deed, the date. From page to the podium, one instantly appreciates in Professor Sadurski a scrupulous scholar, a brave and proud citizen of his beloved Poland, and an engaging and accessible teacher. For all of these reasons, I'm delighted that he could be here with us to help make sense of these times and to learn from democracies that have survived. Finally, I want to thank Professor Hubert Tworzecki, our current democracy fellow in the Fox Center and professor of political science here at Emory, for proposing today's special event and for joining Professor Sadurski in discussion that will follow his formal talk. So there's going to be a logistical little moment of pause in between the formal address and our discussion on stage. So just bear with us during that little transition. I also want to thank my phenomenal Fox Center staff, Mae Veloso-Lyons, Kaylin McAdams, Carl Mary Acre, and Percy Thompson, who have made all of the details and decisions come together today. And I want to thank all of you for being here.
I'm extremely grateful for this invitation. This is great pleasure and great honor for me to speak in this wonderful university, one of the best in the world, and especially to speak to the Fox Center. My debt goes to you, Professor Freeman, to your team, to Professor Hubert Tworzecki, and of course to all of you who came here. So, you know, I had been talking about this event with Professor Tworzecki for some time now, and how could I realize that it require such a special topicality these days here in this country. And I hope that maybe some of the things which I'll be talking about when addressing a comparative scene of contemporary populism, you will be able to adapt and refer to your own situation or your own thinking about where the United States stands now and where it is going. So as you see, I'm talking about a special brand of populism, about authoritarian populism. Because not every populism is authoritarian. We may think of, for example, Prime Minister of Italy, Mrs. Meloni, who is in many ways populist in her policies, but hasn't shown any particular authoritarian temptations so far. And we may also talk about authoritarianism, which is not populist. No one would ever probably call the current ruler of North Korea or the former ruler of Syria to be populist. That would be a great understatement. So both the adjective and the noun in this aggregate concept, authoritarian populism, is equally important. Now imagine you come to power through democratic means. You win the election in clean, fair, and free democratic way, and yet you would like to entrench yourself in power beyond the first term, hopefully before the second term. You can do many things. For example, you can start by depicting the opposition, that is the incumbent who has just lost to you, as being fundamentally disloyal, illegitimate. You can even shout things like, lock her up, okay? I mean, these are people who are not deserving of confidence from the nation who has just elected you. You attack courts' independence and try to capture top courts, the Supreme Court or constitutional courts where they exist as separate from top courts. You'll realize, for reasons I will mention a little bit later, why courts are such an important resource that you would like really to capture, to own, and to control. You will do your best to weaken the independent media. For example, by denying them government or state commercials, advertising, you'll try to undermine media's independence, especially if in your country public media are important, perhaps more important than is the case of media seen here in the United States. But in many European states, public media are the most important, especially when it comes to news and current affairs programs. So you will try to put your own people head those media. You will have special antipathy to the civil society because you understand that non-governmental organizations are a constant threat to you. So you will both try to intimidate them, for example, depict them as enemies of the state. But at the same time, you will try to foster and cultivate your own pro-government media, usually of the conservative traditionalist sort, if that's your political ideology. You will politicize civil service. You identify it as a deep state that needs to be addressed, and therefore you will remove guarantees of its neutrality and professionalism. Of course, security services will be on the top of your targets. You will need to look after your party supporters. If you are a party leader, you need to give them positions of power, of privilege, and of course, money. You will give them special contracts and so on. Sometime during your term of office, perhaps not at the beginning, you'll start thinking about how to control and possibly capture the electoral administration, because you'll know that the elections will come and you'll need the electoral administrators to be on your side. You will think also of restricting academic freedom, freedom of assembly, speech and press, not necessarily through instituting any prior restraint, called also known as censorship, but in various ways you will restrict press freedoms. And finally, you will emphasize the sovereignty of your nations, the sovereignty of your people, and criticize the sovereignty of your country, and criticize various transnational organizations, United Nations, European Union, Inter-American Court of Human Rights, etc., because you feel that these transnational bodies may be a sort of important criticism of your rule and also of support for the opposition. So you have this populist decalogue, 10 things. All these 10 things happened in my home country, that is in Poland. And this is a playbook for authoritarian populists. And I'm sure you recognize many countries called authoritarian populist, whether it's Turkey or India, or Brazil under Bolsonaro, or the Philippines under Duterte, etc., which display many, sometimes all of these 10 characteristics. So let us be now a little bit, this is a moment of, if I may say, commercial advertising. These are, there are two books which I would like, not so much to recommend that you buy, but refer to so that you know where in more in-depth way I describe these views of mine. The first I wanted to mention, both of them were mentioned by Professor Freeman in her very generous introduction. So one was published specifically about Poland, and I show it to you because I like the cover so much. I think it's a beautiful photo. And another one has also beautiful cover, this time not a photo, but an artwork. and that is called a pandemic of populists, which is much more comparative, not just about Poland. So let us be little bit more systematic in defining what we are talking about. What are characteristics of authoritarian populism today? And I would like to say, to simplify the matters, that it's a regime which blockades itself halfway between liberal democracy, a good, consolidated, safe liberal democracy. Think about Norway. Think about Canada. Think about New Zealand or Australia, countries which usually had the, say, Freedom House ranking of most democratic states. This is a certain ideal model. Each of these countries have their problems, but these are problems, so to speak, at the fringes rather than in the very essence of those countries. And authoritarian populism is not like that, but it shares with the liberal democracy a very important characteristic, that the rulers come from free and by and large fair elections. Of course, this fairness of elections is always a matter of degree, and there are all sorts of tricks that authoritarian populists, when they come to power, will use, but they basically respect their citizens' right to vote. So these are not countries like Russia, or Belarus, or China, where elections are a sham event, a facade. The elections in authoritarian populism usually are relatively clean. But they locate themselves also, they have some characteristics of much more what I call fully fledged authoritarian government. That is, they basically abandon what is usually known as separation of powers or checks and balances, something on which we'll be talking about. So they borrow from liberal democracy respect for elections, from which generate the government. But they also borrow from the fully fledged authoritarianism, disregard for checks and balances. In this way, we may see it as, from institutional point of view, something in between. But there was a very good description, if you like, non-academic, but I think telling description of what I consider here authoritarian populism by two great political scientists, Levitsky and Ziblatt. I understand that Professor Levitsky was your speaker and visitor here. And they say, look, imagine that you came to power in a democratic way, just like I described, and you want to maintain your rule for as long as possible. Put yourself in the shoes of a dishonest coach, say of football, and you want to do anything to make sure that your team wins. You would do three things. You change the rules of the game, even during the game. Say in soccer, you announce, oh, from now on, we don't recognize the rule about the offside. Okay? Or, we will have 13 players and you have only 9. Things like this, changing the rules. The second is you change the arbiter. You put your own umpire who will be biased towards you. And you weaken the opponents in any way you can. And that's exactly a nice metaphor for what populists, authoritarian populists, do when they come to power. They change the rules, in particular, change the constitution. If they don't have a constitution making or amending power, and for example, in Poland they didn't have, but in Venezuela they did have. In Turkey they didn't have, but in Hungary they did. So you change the constitution. If you don't have the power, the sufficient majority to change the constitution, you reinterpret it in a way which de facto changes its meaning. Okay? Well, in other countries, you may say, okay, I don't recognize the 14th Amendment right to birthright because I understand it differently. So you can change the constitution without changing the text. Change of the arbiters, judges, of course. Judges are the arbiters in a democracy. You know, you control them. You peg the court with your party loyalists, and you weaken the opponent. That is the opposition. By, for example, not allowing it to use its time in the public debate in the parliament, etc. So now let me say something about populisms in plural. And I would like to use as a motto a paraphrase of probably one of the most famous openings of any novel ever. And that is of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, who famously begins this beautiful book by saying, happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And I would like to paraphrase it as, happy democracies are all alike. Every unhappy or failed democracy is failed and unhappy in its own way. And that explains my approach to authoritarian populism, which is a case of failed democracy, of unhappy or defective democracy. And I believe that we should dispense with the attitude that many political scientists have when they talk about populism, about the advancement of populism in the world, sort of imagining through this word that it's a singular phenomenon. No, there are different populisms, and the differences stem from the fact that they are triggered by different sources. And different countries have different problems. Populism is always an answer to real problem. It's a wrong answer, but the problem is real. Real problems are different in different countries. So when I look at the variety of populism's sources, I see the following. Sometimes it's mainly a sense of economic insecurity and what sociologists call status anxiety. I may not be necessarily in the lowest rank of the, say, economic status in the country, but I always feel that I can fall lower. I don't have the sense that, say, the next generation, that my children will be better off than I am, just to the contrary. They may be worse off than I am, and their children will be even worse off. That's status anxiety. Another is xenophobia, dislike of the quote unquote others. This may be others in a racial or national sense, immigrants from countries where people have different color of skin than we have, or have different religion, or different habits, or different cultural systems. We just don't like them. Then there is usually disenchantment with the current incumbent, with the, say, if the current ruling party rules for more than one term, 2 terms, we get certain fatigue about them, and we find more and more reasons to try to find a positive alternative. Number 4 is the dislike of globalization, resentment about globalization and internationalism. We feel that we are losing our jobs to countries where the labor price is much lower than here, and we are inundated with cheap products from those countries, and that type of globalization is deeply unsettling for us. And finally, what may be called cultural and religious resentment, which I would call anti-enlightenment, dislike of rationalism, dislike of, say, cultural and ethical novelties, of genuine gender equality, of tolerance to sexual minorities, and so on. The sense that, you know, the good old religion is somehow losing its place, its privileged place in our society. Now, if you look at the map here, at these 5 sources, then they appear in different countries in different configuration. Probably in every populist countries, you will find some aspects of these attitudes and these sources. but differently in different countries. For example, in my home country, in Poland, there is very little of resentment against globalization and international, but a very strong sense of dislike for secularism and Enlightenment values. So you may have a map, if you like, a taxonomy of different really existing populist authoritarian systems depending on how different of these sources interact with each other and appear in different countries. And my sense is that populists are successful. That is, they manage to win power, because they don't win power everywhere. Everywhere now we have populist parties, but not every populist party is a ruling party. Right? The populists are successful when they manage to convince their society that they have a good, simple, single answer to more than one of these two prejudices or resentments or emotions. No algorithm there, of course, but this is this ability to put together those various sources, mental, cultural, economic sources of populism is the source of populist victory. Now, I would like to say something about polarization, because there are various myths about the concept of polarization. Polarization may be a healthy matter. Polarization may be just another word for pluralism. And we want our societies to be pluralist. We don't see it as an aberration, but just to the contrary, as a source of wealth. But there is polarization which is toxic or pernicious. And I would say that polarization is toxic when it combines three characteristics that regular democratic pluralism normally does not display, or if it does display, then it does so to a very low degree. So the first one is a simple one, the polarization which becomes extreme, by which I mean that there are fewer and fewer overlaps between different, if you like, groups of the society, say between Republicans and Democrats in the United States. Years ago, there were plenty of overlaps, and Democrats and Republicans might have agreed on several common points. Now it's almost like two archipelagos, which are driven away more and more from each other. The second is that this toxic polarization is negative rather than positive. That is, that the feelings of dislike and antipathy to them greatly prevails over the feeling of support and perhaps love to our own leaders. The hate dominates over the commitment and support. And thirdly, that it is moralized. And this is perhaps the most dangerous aspect of toxic polarization. We moralize polarization in the sense that we believe that you, my opponent, is not only mistaken, which is normal. I mean, in democracy, your opponent by definition is mistaken. Otherwise, you would have their views rather than yours. Okay? So in disagreement, you must believe that the opponent is mistaken. But in toxic polarization, it's more than mistaken. They are bad people. They are immoral. They are sinful. And therefore, this is a judgmental polarization. And I would like to mention one interesting case of polarization, which was recently very nicely described in an article by Professor Hubert Tworzecki, where he talked about top-down polarization, describing the situation in Poland. We normally believe that the rulers, and I'm trying to paraphrase Hubert, and I hope that he will be able to talk about it in our discussion. But we normally think that polarization at the level of government or political parties is sort of expression of the societal polarization. People dislike each other along various cleavages, whether they are political or partisan or religious or whatever, and that somehow is translated into the battle up there. But no, Hubert says, in Poland, we have a strange case, and maybe this is an example which can be generalized, where the polarization is generated from above. It's a top-down rather than bottom-up. That is the polarization sort of manufactured for political reasons. And that, by the way, as an aside, as a speculation, gives me a little bit of hope. Because if this polarization comes from above, maybe it will be not as persistent and as sticky and stable as polarization which comes from bottom up. Now, let me say a word about the institutional trajectories of countries which have been undergoing authoritarian populist path. And again, Poland is one of my case studies, but I have already listed quite a number of other countries which fit that picture. And what is important is that very often this trajectory, the move towards authoritarian populism, is somehow obscure. It's not very visible. There are certain characteristics of these trajectories which render populism not clearly recognizable from the very beginning. Why? Well, first of all, because the authoritarian populist evolution is incremental. It's not like the traditional coup d'etat. Okay, we know when it happened, on midnight from that day to that day, and now we see, and there are tanks in the streets and plenty of political prisoners. No, it goes step by step. Doesn't mean that it's very slow. It must be maybe actually very, very fast. But for example, in Poland, it took an entire year, more or less from the end of 2015 to the end of 2016. And my criterion for that is the various steps of taking control over Constitutional Tribunal, which is a key body and guarantee of democracy in Poland. So because it is incremental, we tend not to notice the change. It's a little bit like the two great students of scholars of democratic degeneration, Aziz Hook and Tom Ginsburg, of University of Chicago, use this very unappetizing example of boiling frog. You slowly turn the heat up, and you don't know when it actually happened, but the end result is the frog is dead. And also you look back and say, oh, something happened in our country. We have crossed a certain threshold, but when did it happen? It's very difficult to identify. The second reason is that most of the toxic and invidious changes are not changes of one particular aspect or institution, but they reside in a accumulation, interaction between different institutions. So in my book, in this constitutional breakdown, I describe and I go into some technical matters about, how you can't really understand the changes, the toxic changes in courts, unless you also understand toxic changes in the presidency and in the parliament and the public prosecutions, and that these things connect with each other. Well, for many people, it's not recognizable. Not many people are specialized lawyers who understand all these, or political scientists who understand those mutual interdependencies. And that is why so many people would say, but wait a moment, why do you make such a fuss about it? I mean, similar things to X or Y and Z are also in perfectly unimpeachable democracies. That's the usual argument we've heard in Poland. Why do you, judges are also appointed politically in Canada or in Germany, so what's the problem? Yeah, but it's not that you take just one aspect of the damage and say, don't be paranoid, don't over dramatize, what's a big deal, but that it is part and parcel of something much more comprehensive. So I use an argument, a virus in a healthy body may be actually a good thing, to build up your autoimmune system. Virus in, by and large, sick body can be toxic and can bring about death. And the last point, which is important from my point of view, is that the formal institutions remain intact. Authoritarian populists very rarely fundamentally change the shape of constitution. Of institutions. Venezuela was an exception here. But most of the countries I discussed mainly maintain the institutions as they were. So it all looks business as usual. But it's not. Because while the institution exists from an external point of view in exactly the same way as before, there's the same president and the parliament and this court and that court and prosecutor general and things like that, in fact, these institutions are being hollowed out. They exist as before, but something very, very important changed about them. And I think that it is worth to very briefly, we are not all lawyers, so I won't go into any deep discussion here, but to unpack this concept of hollowing out of the institutions, because it's just a metaphor which requires some clarification. So in the second book of mine, which I mentioned, this Pandemic of Populists, I have developed a certain taxonomy of the main manners in which populist authoritarians hollow out institutions. The first one is most simple, capture. You put your own people, okay? You peg the court, for example. If you cannot easily peg the court, now you increase its number so that, like Hungarians did, so that you add your own loyalists and then your loyalists get a majority on the court. You capture them. You duplicate them. That is, you add some new institutions invisible to the constitution because you don't have, suppose, as a assumption, you don't have constitutional majority, you cannot change the constitution. You create by statutes new institutions, which sort of shadow, which parallel existing institutions, and in that time they take over the dominant role. You erode the existing institutions, for example, deny them funds, change their competences and powers. You move or quote unquote migrate, as in migrating computer files from one place to another. You know, you migrate an institution from one place to another, like in Poland, the public prosecutor has been made part of the Ministry of Justice, or in Hungary, the ombudsman or ombudspersons, there are multiple ombudsmen in Hungary, were simply became civil servants, which more or less undermines their point, okay? And finally, you restructure them internally. Like Polish Supreme Court has been completely restructured inside, so that from the outside, it is still the same building, which by the way, you see now on this slide, but inside it consists of different chambers, differently recruited judges and so on, and it's brand new. So you can see here the whole menu of the ways for hollowing out the institutions, so that from the outside, including literally from a position of foreigners, you look at it and say, nothing changed there. Well, in fact, everything changed there. And this change is most visible when it comes to courts. I call them here the least resilient branch, which is a deliberate paraphrase of one of the most famous books in American constitutional law by Alexander Bickel, the least dangerous branch. So Bickel, then professor at Yale Law School years ago, published this book about US Supreme Court called The Least Resilient Branch, the least dangerous branch. But at the same time, the other side of the coin, which I now add, is that is the least resilient branch, that courts are somehow most easy to be captured of all the institutions. And why do authoritarian populists have such a special antipathy to courts? Well, I explain it by saying that they are probably the most obvious branch which claims and can claim and can emphasize its alternative legitimacy. That is, the courts are legitimate, but they are legitimate not in a way in which political branches are legitimate, that is by virtue of being popularly elected. And I would say that direct election of judges, which has place in some states in this country, is rather an exception than a rule. Because it generally thought, no, judges derive their legitimacy not from the fact that they were elected, but that they combined professionalism with impartiality. That's the source of their legitimacy. And authoritarian populists cannot tolerate any other important branch in their country which can offer legitimacy other than theirs. Remember, I said that populist authoritarians come to power, at least in the first term, through regular, free, and by and large, fair elections. That's their source of legitimacy. And now they face an important branch which can present and claim their own different source of legitimacy. That's why courts are so hated by populist politicians. They can do different things. They can produce or organize a hostile takeover. That is through court packing, through institutional restructuring, even through denigration. When a president calls judges names and uses various offensive words about judges, and of course I have in mind President Bolsonaro and his criticism of Brazil. Maybe not only. Okay. Then it's not innocent. I mean, this stays. It affects, weakens the institution. And so, if I had time, I would talk more about national constitutional judiciary, but I will drop it. And that all leads to the situation in judges themselves may become willful enablers of the authoritarian populist will. And that reverses a traditional logic in a democracy where judges are considered to be a counter-majoritarian force, and it's a good thing too, that they are meant to represent that part of constitutional democracy which requires sticking to the constitution, in particular when it comes to protection of minorities. So if we sometimes say that democracy means majority rule and protection of minorities, then parliament is in charge of majority rule, but courts of minority rights. But if now courts become willfully enablers, assistants, aids to the government, whether legislative majority or the executive, then the fundamental raison d'etre of the courts is being undermined, and that has been well exemplified by the top court in Poland called Constitutional Tribunal, which is now basically just a facade. And there wasn't talking about law, populist authoritarians, in contrast to many other authoritarians, actually take law relatively seriously. That is, they use law as an instrument of their power. And here is a beautiful motto from Peruvian president years ago, which may be seen as a motto for talking about what Kurt Weiland of University of Texas, Austin, Texas, called discriminatory legalism. Everything for my friends, for my enemies, the law. And I have been on the receiving end of that motto, as Professor Freeman mentioned in her introduction. And I put this photo only as an informative point rather than for some narcissistic reasons, because a friend of mine has taken a photo of me in a Warsaw courtroom where I faced one of those cases against me. But really the most important thing in this photo is not my face there, but this beautiful badge, which is a Polish translation of the word constitution, which became an iconic slogan for just constitution, for the anti-populist movement in Poland in 2015-2023. How do they use the law? Well, normal thing: defamation suits, indictments against the opponents, full impunity for the offenders, sometimes realized through massive presidential pardons, of course, and legal harassment of independent judges, public prosecutors, journalists, and opinion leaders. So as you see, the picture of authoritarian populism is not a very nice picture. How can we get out of it? And this will be my last slide and my last point. Because it seems that in today's world, when we look at authoritarian populism around the world, there is no room for any other way of reversing the situation than good old electoral way, through democratic elections, even if the elections in which populists run are deeply biased in favor of the incumbents and against their democratic opponents. There is no other way. There is no room for revolution, either from bottom up or brought from the outside by European Union. I mean, there can be forms of external help, but there's no other way than by electoral method. Some people hope, Kurt Weiland, a great scholar, political scientist working on populism, believes that, and some people do believe that at least some populist authoritarianisms have this gene of self-destruction, that they are so irrational and so counterproductive that they will self-destruct. But unfortunately, countries such as Turkey or India show that populists have very, very strong staying power. So what are the main conditions for electoral victories over populists? Three, very simple. There is nothing original in what I'll say here, because I can't find any other, magic wand which would do away with populists. This, first of all, high turnout. It seems to me, although here the jury is still out when it comes to the political scientists, and it seems to me that in many countries, not necessarily everywhere, probably it did not apply in these countries before resulting in the election of Donald Trump, but in many countries it seems that the higher turnout favors democratic opposition rather than populists. Maybe because populists have a very disciplined electorate base and they more or less exhaust the entire base they have. So any quote unquote surplus may rather come from the median voters or undecided, and therefore they can help the democratic opposition. I say it with a certain hesitation because I haven't found really convincing final vindication of this thesis, but it seems to me. It certainly was the case in Poland in 2023, when everyone, I think, agrees that the electoral victory of Democrats was mainly due to incredibly high turnout by Polish standard, at least, or by standard of European democracies where voting is not compulsory. It was nearly 75%, 74.6%, and which was over 10% more than in the usual similar parliamentary elections before, in previous, and the sociological inquiries show that this surplus mainly went to the democratic opposition, and by the way, mainly came from women, and even more mainly came from young women. That young women was the segment of the electorate which was largely decisive for the victory of the coalition around Donald Tusk. The second point, again, no-brainer, unity of the opposition. Unity of the opposition is very important, not only because in various electoral systems, especially of proportional representation, the big coalitions mainly get a bonus from the way the votes are counted. But also because the unity of the opposition projects that the opposition is ready for responsible government, and that has a very important significance to many voters. And finally, convincing program. What else can be said about convincing program? I just want to say this, and that will be probably my last thought, definitely my last thought in this introduction, that we Democrats, we people who dislike populists, we shouldn't believe that populist voters should be despised. They vote for some reasons. And for all we know, they may be equally intelligent as we are and rational. But they have certain problems. We Democrats should take these problems with respect and give them our non-populist answers. And that applies also to not just to, say, rational economics, etc., but also to identity problems. We shouldn't believe that people of faith are somehow less rational than people who are secular. We wouldn't despise the concepts of identity or community or patriotism, but we should give them our democratic interpretation, which is inclusive rather than exclusive and doesn't lead to discrimination of other people. This is, of course, a very, very tall order, but no one ever promised that the task of winning against populist authoritarians is an easy one. Thank you very much.
I would like to begin our conversation by returning to your slide on societal demand for authoritarian populism. It is a question that has received a great deal of attention from political scientists. Much work has been done trying to understand in a variety of countries whether the patterns we observe across the globe are driven more by some kind of unsatisfied demand from some segments of society for systemic change, or whether they are driven by essentially self-interested politicians trying to change the system in self-serving ways, right? That's the key question. In my own work on Poland, I have found this question especially vexing because Poland does not really fit very well the patterns we have observed elsewhere. In my own work, I have even referred to Poland as a deviant case, quote unquote, because when the populists were on the road to power in 2014, 2015, the work of my group, I am part of a research team that has been working on the Polish national elections study for many years, as well as our colleagues in similar groups, noted that at the time, satisfaction with life, with prospects for the future, was at its highest that it had ever been since we began doing these polls in the early 90s. And here you have these authoritarian populists coming to power on a message of everything is terrible, let's burn everything down. And this actually gets traction with society. So that is puzzling. Poland at the time had a very strong economy, a very low rate of unemployment. As you noted, this whole losers of globalization thesis did not apply because it was one of the countries that had greatly benefited from globalization. It had no immigrants to speak of. So the idea of cultural backlash against demographic change was also absent. So that is an interesting case which opens the possibility, at least for me, that maybe what populists are capitalizing on is not necessarily dissatisfaction with the status quo, but a kind of a prospective appeal, that what they promise is they promise to open possibilities for the future which would not be achievable under like regular democratic politics. And there are like two specific aspects to it that I would like to mention as possibilities. One is a replacement of merit with loyalty in the case of promotions to various jobs, right? We promise to abolish essentially meritocratic promotions with promotions based on political loyalty, which means that many, many people who could not have possibly advanced to various positions in the bureaucracy, in the judiciary, in the civil service, etc., suddenly have their employment prospects greatly increased. They become the regime's most loyal core, if you will. And for the broader society, I would like to propose at least the possibility that what these authoritarian populists are promising is the prospect of replacing achieved markers of status with sort of ascribed ones, right? That they are promising. In Poland, this was referred to as the promise of redistribution of esteem. Mm-hmm. Not on the basis of what you have achieved in life, but sort of who you are, which of course we see in other countries as well, the use of racism, sexism, right? I mean, this is very common across many. So I'm just wondering, this kind of retrospective dissatisfaction with the status quo versus the appeal of something in the future unachievable through regular politics.
Yes, I agree very much with much of your analysis. Let me perhaps say this, that at least in your industry, in political science, there is a popular distinction between the demand side and the supply side, including when it comes to populism. And I think that one argument which can be made based on your observation that countries like Poland, Hungary for that matter too, did not meet the usual recognizable conditions for demand for populism, nevertheless provided a strong supply of politicians, of populist politicians, who may have been charismatic, who may have been, I mean, Jarosław Kaczynski was never charismatic. I mean, some people even said that it's a strange case of cult of personality without personality. But he certainly did something right and managed to identify a certain, if you like, coalition of disenchantments or disappointments. And so the possibility of supplying to people program which seems like an easy solution for all their problems is a matter of supply, not so much of demand. But of course, in the end, there must be something which is about the resentment or dissatisfaction. Maybe it's dissatisfaction without obvious reasons for it. Maybe it's, call it false consciousness. Maybe it's some form of collective irrationality. Because you are right, why be afraid of immigration if there are basically no migrants? Why be afraid of losing your status if actual economic indicia are very good and all the indicators suggest that it's a country which is undergoing a rather successful period? But there must always be a sense that we may be about to lose it. There were some good sociological studies done in Poland showing that those who supported populism weren't at the lower rank of the society. They were sort of like second or even third from below. They could see that some people, it's like relative deprivation, that some people have made much better than them, but other are below. And rather than having empathy to those who are below, they resent them because they may get welfare support or things like that. So that, they do not deserve to be looked after by the state. But look, when it comes to your point about replacing merit with loyalty, I fully agree with that. And there, in the countries in which there are many state-owned enterprises, there are plenty of positions which are very well paid, which may be taken by people who do not have any merit and qualifications, but who will get it as part of the political giveaways. And there was this, you mentioned this so-called redistribution of prestige, I think was the
Esteem.
word. Esteem, yeah. It sounds like nonsense. I mean, esteem is not something that can be redistributed, just as admiration cannot be redistributed. But they really meant it, the Law and Justice Party. They really meant, well, why are some people held in lower esteem? We will now reverse this hierarchy. So yeah, there are many things on which I agree with you here.
I also wonder about your thoughts on the dynamics of democratic erosion, on the trajectories that various countries may take, depending on a range of factors at play. Let me suggest one possibility, and I'm just curious about your thoughts about this particular dynamic. So one could argue that when discussing authoritarian populism, we are, as you said, talking about hybrid regimes, essentially, where elections still matter. They are not fake, they are not a sham, they are still competitive to some extent. Incumbents may still lose them. And furthermore, the usual laws of electoral politics still apply. Fatigue sets in. Incumbents lose popularity with the passage of time. People who may have voted for them at one point become disappointed with what these incumbents are actually achieving or not achieving when they are in office. So the law of political gravity still applies, right? Popularity eventually declines with time. But of course, the institutional environment does not remain constant, right? The authoritarian populists are racing to transform the playing field to their advantage, to tilt it to their advantage. So we are looking at something like a race, essentially, between sort of entropy, between the dissipation of the coalition that initially brought the authoritarian populists to power, and institutional capture. Which is going to happen first may determine the outcome, at least in the medium term. I mean, what happens over many decades, of course, is another question, but at least in the medium term, is that the sort of dynamic that you think might be at play in some countries that where these kinds of phenomena have been going on?
Yes, I think so. And I think that there are many, many signs and symptoms that some of those laws of political trajectories, fatigue with the people there, etc., plus certain hollowing out of the institution, but mainly fatigue of the electorate sets in and affects also populists. Look, Narendra Modi won the elections, but with a much lower support than he enjoyed before, and he was forced into what he considered to be humiliating need to enter into coalition. Erdogan in Turkey nearly lost. He won, but now he has to move to more and more restrictive and draconian means, such as imprisoning his main rival, the mayor of Istanbul. Orban, now for the first time, has a real rival who in popularity polls prevails over him. So I think in Poland, Tusk won over Kaczynski and his people, even though there were huge institutional biases, including in the running of the election itself. So I think there are some cases for certain optimism. That is that the good weather for populists may soon actually be a matter of the history of the past.
So thinking about these endpoints, thinking about trajectories and the eventual point at which authoritarian populists may find themselves on the cusp of losing power, I want to raise a point made many years ago by the great comparative political scientist Adam Przeworski about the fundamental logic of democracy. Przeworski famously said that democracy only works because the losers agree to lose because they don't expect anything bad to happen to them, yes, if they do. And it's something of a paradox, isn't it? I mean, if that's the fundamental logic, then like what is the incentive to behave oneself while in office? Because if you think that nothing bad is going to happen, you will not be held to account for any corruption or abuse of office, because after all, the survival of democracy depends on nothing bad happening. Isn't that a sort of perverse incentive for politicians to misbehave?
Well, that's a great dilemma, of course, because in countries such as Poland now, where there have been so much corruption, nepotism, and abuse of law and violations of law, to let the losers get away with their guilt without any accountability would be deeply demoralizing for the future. But you are right. At the same time, if this accountability is administered in a rigorous way, as it should, then for future populists, it will create an example, a memento, let's not give away power because we may end up in jail, as they did. I would, and yes, I agree with this very nice maxim of Adam Przeworski that democracy is the system in which governments can lose election rather than win election. Okay, that's when we know. So I believe that in practical sense, a practical implication of this incentive-related argument is to make sure that when Democrats win over authoritarian populists, that A, they administer all the means of accountability provided by the law, but at the same time politically do everything to prevent the populist return to power. Of course, not by any dirty tricks with the electoral law, etc., but by having better policies and not allowing to develop this demand for populist rule, even if there is supply.
So as a side note to this broader point, in a specific case of Eastern Europe, for many decades now, there has been this long-running debate in many countries of the region about holding the former communist rulers accountable in some way for their time in office. Various debates about so-called lustration, various debates about denying them the opportunity to run for office again or hold important public functions. Different countries address these debates in different ways, but I wonder to what extent, or would you agree that there was something to the argument that not holding these former, not authoritarian populists, but outright authoritarians accountable encouraged a later generation of politicians, people like Orban, people like Kaczynski, precisely on this logic that, well, what is the downside of being an autocrat if at the end of the day you can just say, okay, I quit, and right? It is a really peculiar sort of set of incentives, I would say, to precisely to misbehave.
Well, I'm not sure about that, because when I think about all these debates after the fall of communism, what to do with or to former communists, everything really depended on how they behaved themselves. And in the countries in which they tried to stick to power, like in Czechoslovakia as it was then, the rules of lustration decommunization were much, much more harsh. In the countries in which they entered to the so-called round table and sought consensus and behaved properly after the agreements in round tables, as in Poland and then in Hungary, obviously the official attitude of former democratic opposition dissidents, people like Havel or people like Wałęsa, was much more lenient to them because they became collaborators in building the democracy. That was the case with ex-communists in Poland. So, of course, they were given all sorts of incentives. They were giving guarantees of impunity and of good material fortunes, etc. But the fact of the matter is they collaborated in building democracy. This is the opposite to what the former populist government in Poland does. They actually deny de facto legitimacy for the new government. They do nothing to repent or to correct their formal mischief. So I don't think that there is a symmetry here.
Let me turn to the question of resilience. What makes some democracies more resistant to democratic erosion than others? I think in the past, the most obvious answer that political scientists would have offered would be something like institutional design. Some constitutions are just more difficult to change than others, and therefore its potential autocratizers would have a much taller task. And we have seen some examples of easy to change constitutions being easily changed. Case in point, Hungary, where that was precisely the trajectory. But we have also seen some cases of countries with very difficult to change constitutions, where the autocratizers simply bypassed them, which arguably was the Polish pattern, pretending that the constitution no longer is in force, even though technically it still was. So if it's not institutional design, what is it that makes for a more resilient system?
I would be happy to engage in this discussion, but perhaps, Hubert, what do you think? Isn't it the time to give our audience an opportunity to ask questions and make points? And maybe there will be some question which will allow us to face these issues, to address those issues.
I'm thinking about South Africa and the Truth and Reconciliation that they did when they had a big government change. And I think that would go a long ways towards the non-punishment of the authoritarians. If you have the people coming out and saying things that they couldn't before under that regime. So I'm a proponent of that, and I'd like to hear what you have to say.
So yes, I mean, there is already a vast body of literature on so-called transitional justice and the best ways of achieving this, and truth and reconciliation commissions are certainly one way of going about it. Poland is going through this process right now and is considering the best ways of going forward in terms of how politicians should be held accountable. It was not a case of repression of the sort we had previously seen in cases where Truth and Reconciliation Commissions were employed. So right now in Poland, we are seeing sort of more individual cases of former politicians being held accountable for abuse of office, corruption. So I think it's that. So I think it really depends on the severity of the crimes, severity of the abuses, and yeah, I mean, that would be my way of answering that.
Yes, and I would add only that I also thought why those mechanisms, say, characteristic of South Africa after apartheid, why they were never picked up, maybe with the exception of former German Democratic Republic, in a slightly different way. But why these institutions were never used? And it seems to me that one of the reasons perhaps was that the situation of former rulers from the point of view of the degree of support in the society is quite more complex and difficult in countries such as Poland today, or Brazil after the fall of Bolsonaro, than it was in the case of South Africa. I mean, with apartheid, the situation, so to speak, was clear. I mean, the cleavages were obvious. And also to many, many white Democrats, it was clear that the system is fundamentally untenable and that now that it's gone, there should be some way of letting former offenders to somehow meet their victims in court and speak about it. In Poland, we don't have that situation. In Poland, about 30% of people support law and justice. And if you put together the numbers of support for current democratic opposition with the support for former ruling party and the new extreme right-wing parties, it's almost 50-50. So who will reconciliate with whom? I mean, there needs to be a certain battle of ideas in the society before, so that I think that reconciliation, truth and reconciliation bodies are perfectly acceptable in the situation in which there is perfect clarity about the evil nature of the former regime, whether it's apartheid or various Latin American countries after military rule. It's not the case in Poland.
So thank you so much for this presentation. It's very chilling for us right now. Early on, you made a very helpful clarifying thing that this authoritarian populism resides midway or somewhere in between liberalism and brute authoritarianism. But in hearing all of what you're saying, it seems to me that it's not less pernicious. It's not like, well, at least we don't have a Putin or an Assad. It strikes me as actually more, in a certain way, more pernicious, but what we have is a regime that's borrowing its power from democratic legitimacy to, as you say, to completely hollow out civil society. So what we're left with is a kind of replicant, a body snatcher of what looks like democracy. It's really deeply chilling, and I think we're witnessing that right now. So I'm just wondering how you would respond to that.
Well, I beg to disagree for various reasons. First of all, there is a simple test. Where would you rather live, in Russia or in, say, Hungary? And I don't have much doubts about it. What you call crude or this unrestrained authoritarianism is a system of cruelty, while authoritarian populism is not necessarily cruel in the sense that, you know, countries which belong to that hybrid system do not have normally political prisoners or many political prisoners. When it becomes cruel, as it was under Duterte, or it seems now will be under Erdogan, we stop sort of classifying, maybe just a semantic truth, but we stop classifying those countries as populist authoritarians. And Trump's system is cruel to many people, to so-called illegal immigrants, but I don't think it's particularly cruel to its own people, although to its own citizens. Although I don't have much stake sort of in arguing about that. So cruelty is something that is characteristic of North Korea or Syria or countries like that. These are also one reason why these populist authoritarians are less invidious is that these systems seem to be, at least in the long run, relatively unstable. That is, they will either move to one category of this unrestrained authoritarianism, and we see some, as I said, sadly it happened in Venezuela, or they return to more liberal democratic system as we see in Poland. Well, so there is this instability which gives us hope. Well, there is no instability in North Korea, unfortunately, you know. So I would not necessarily agree with the judgment. I don't know, what do you think, Hubert?
No, I mean, that's the essence. It's the hybridity, and it's absolutely correct, I think, that with hybridity comes instability, or at least potential for change, which is absent in other regimes.
I want to say thanks again for the talk. This actually dovetails right into my next question. When you look at history and when it comes to authoritarianism and maintaining power, do you think that a more populist approach maintains power, I guess, in authoritarian governments, more so than a brutal one? However, you also mentioned that it will tend towards either, you know, disintegrating or becoming brutal. Has there ever been a case where it kind of maintains in the middle and the individual maintains power, or it tends towards brutal and, I guess, disintegrates?
Well, I think it probably goes back to what we have been talking about a moment ago. That is that there is a certain degree of instability. And also, when we think about populist authoritarianism, those systems do not maintain the same characteristics throughout even one term of office. We could see that in Venezuela. The system changed very dramatically from Chavez to, what's the current name of? Maduro, sorry, yes. So it may look like being the same system, but it changes. And obviously, if I understood well your point, obviously this populist element, that is an attempt to please the majority, including by being unfair to minorities, is something that maintains populists in power. This is the engine of populist persistence.
I mean, there are examples of really long-lasting hybrid regimes. Mexico under the PRI would be like a classic example of that, which, you know, had been extremely resilient. It lasted for many decades. Whether I would classify it necessarily in, you know, in the same general category as some of the others we have been discussing, I'm not sure. But there's a very famous book by a political scientist called Beatrice Magaloni, precisely, in which she describes what she called the tragic brilliance of PRI's reliance on essentially forcing people to vote for them out of their own free choice, because continued delivery, that's her phrasing, continued delivery of certain public goods like clean water to a given community was made dependent on that community continuing to vote for the PRI. But for this to work, and for this to work consistently over many decades, required a huge investment by the ruling party into capacity to monitor, to punish, etc. So that requires a lot of investment in the sort of infrastructure of hybrid semi-democratic regimes, which many of these contemporary authoritarian populists simply don't have, or they have not had the time to develop it.
Yes, and also one of the prices which are paid by the society for maintaining populist regime are that the cost of minorities become higher and higher. Take Narendra Modi. I mean, he maintains his grip on power largely thanks, well, that's just one aspect, but largely thanks to anti-Muslim policies and to more and more open and draconian discrimination against Muslims and in favor of Hindu people in India. And it is a popular policy. So it's populist in that sense. It's populist, it's popular, and then, at the same time, it deeply violates individual and minority rights. So that's the real cost of persistence of populism, that they have to probably move to more and more illiberal moves. Otherwise, they will lose their elections, like Bolsonaro did. I mean, Bolsonaro is a very interesting case because he basically ruled without importantly dismantling the institutional structure of Brazilian democracy.
I wanted to ask you about what I see as a more recent influence, particularly I think we've seen it in the US context, but it's worldwide, and that's first social media as a tool to create demand by external forces, the force of external propaganda, like Russian influence in an American election. Plus now even technically, though it may be, even yesterday or last week in Wisconsin, domestic influence through the Citizens United court ruling that allowed uncontrolled spending from groups that are not even resident in the state where the vote is being selected. So do you see we're in a world now where the reality is that populism is, or authoritarian populism is easier to create false demand, I'll call it, and external influences are more prevalent, and therefore we're living in a world where authoritarian populism is more likely to occur and sustain than before? And could you just comment about the role of social media?
Yes, absolutely. I think that there is absolutely no doubt, at least in the literature, the subject that social media, which come with many positive aspects. I mean, we can have unmediated conversation or debate with whoever wants to read us. At the same time, from the point of view of democracy, carries great dangers. And these dangers are that social media are particularly lend themselves to feeding with various conspiracy theories, and conspiracy theory by its nature is inseparable from populism. There is no populism or authoritarian populism in today's world which does not use a form of conspiracy theory. In case of Hungary, it's Soros. In case of India, these are Muslims. In case of Duterte, these were drug pushers, etc. There is always conspiracy theory in the most traditional form described by Hofstadter, but having new means of spreading this type of nonsense. And the second point which you mentioned is that social media provide incredibly easy and cheap, low-cost ways of external interference. You don't have to invest in your agents who may be caught, who have to come. You just, in St. Petersburg or somewhere else, you employ some people who will create the very well-known now and recognized ways of interference. And now we can be almost sure, even if we have not found any evidence, that Russians interfere in basically every election in which they have a stake in the result. And one of the first will be Poland this May, when there will be presidential elections, which will be very, very important. Why would the Russians interfere only in faraway countries and not in a big, important country which neighbors with them? That's just unthinkable. So yes, I agree with both points.
A classic recent case would be the Romanian presidential election of last November. Right, hundreds of thousands of fake TikTok accounts created and monitored and operated presumably from Russia. Created out of nothing this candidacy of this ultra-nationalist Tworzecki, I believe was the name of the candidate. And the result was that the election has been annulled, and this raised a whole bunch of tricky questions, because actually, calling an election null and void because of foreign interference, I mean, that's pretty close to the line, right? I mean, yes, democracies should not be helpless in the face of foreign intervention, but like, where is the line? That is extremely tricky.
You mentioned that in your last slide that elections foment change, but historically, elections are the product rather than the end. In Poland, in Gdansk, in 1970s, and with the movement that Lech Walesa,
Yes.
that changed the structure of Poland.
Mhm.
In this country, with Vietnam, in the late 60s, early 70s, there were incredible mass movements. There were demonstrations of 1 million people in Washington, D.C. And that led to change. It was not just elections. And universities in this country were the center of activity. I just walked through this university, it's very quiet. Where's the, I mean, you see the incipient movement right now, maybe starting up, but where's it going to come from? It's not just elections.
I couldn't agree more with what you have just said. And in fact, that was the last point on my last slide, which I didn't manage to mention because I just thought I need to finish at that point. So thank you for adding it. I think what I said there, that the result of the election doesn't happen on the election day. Election day is only a consequence of a certain process, and it all happens in the social sphere, in the civil society. And the election is only, if you like, some sort of codification of the changes which have already happened. So if you look at Poland now, for example, 23 elections. I mean, the election day finalized certain process which has been going on for a number of years, where there was a growing mobilization along different parts of the anti-governmental agenda, but they were more important. Probably the most visible and the most important was the protest, women protests about women's rights, especially after the horrific decision of so-called Constitutional Tribunal, which de facto delegalized any abortion. Almost like 98% of cases of abortion became illegal under new law. And that was too much. That was one step too far. The government thought that they are very smart because they have conferred or imposed that decision to placate Catholic Church on the Constitutional Tribunal, but no one was duped. And when the Constitutional Tribunal delivered this judgment, women went not to protest against the Constitutional Tribunal because they know it's just a facade. They went straight to the residence of Jarosław Kaczynski, the leader of the party. They knew where it came from. So that type of mobilization, women's movement. Then there was a huge movement of lawyers, judges, prosecutors, legal academics, attorneys, etc., against the so-called reform of the judicial system in 2017, 2018. And there was the famous so-called the March of 1,000 Robes, because there were 1,000 judges who actually protested against it in Poland, also coming from all over Europe. There was the mobilization, the civil society's mobilization was largely supported by mobilization of like-minded civil organizations elsewhere in Europe. And so Europeanization became part of the internal mobilization in Poland. So, and then throughout 2023, a truly charismatic leader and probably the most talented Polish politician of the last several decades, Donald Tusk, managed to bring people out to mass demonstrations in Warsaw twice, I think in June and September, and they created this sort of movement, like orchestra, which plays louder and louder and louder, And then the last tone was just to, in a sense, confirm the societal mobilization in society. So I absolutely agree, and I don't want to be read as someone who considers that the elections per se are meaningful. They are not meaningful per se. They are only meaningful insofar as they express real mobilization and action of civil society. And the opposite is true too. If there is apathy, if there is no mobilization, if there is no civil protest against things which are objectionable, then election just simply endorse the status quo, and that's it.